The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, tucked between a seed catalog and the electric bill. Ethan Cole almost tossed it onto the kitchen counter without opening it. Then he saw the bank's name. 3 months earlier, the bank had foreclosed on the old Mercer property, nearly 600 acres of timber and pasture beyond the northern edge of Ethan's farm. He hadn't paid much attention. Banks bought land. Banks sold land. The Cole family had worked the same 87 acres for 42 years. He tore open the envelope. By the second paragraph, he stopped. Then he read it again. Access and infrastructure maintenance fee, $1,200. According to the letter, Ethan owed $1,200 for continued use of the private crossing connecting his property to the county road. He stared at the page. Private crossing? He walked to the window. Beyond the barn, the gravel lane descended toward Miller Creek. Across the narrow waterway stood an old timber bridge, silver gray from 4 decades of rain, heat, frost, and muddy tractor tires. His bridge. His father's bridge. For an instant, Ethan was 8 years old again, sitting on an overturned bucket beside the creek while Samuel Cole stood waist-deep in brown water, guiding a timber beam into place. Ethan remembered chains clanking, the smell of creosote-treated lumber, his mother carrying coffee down from the farmhouse, and his father laughing when the first beam finally settled where it belonged. Samuel had built that bridge with borrowed equipment, neighbor, labor, and money the family could barely spare. The bank hadn't bought it. They hadn't repaired it after the 2008 flood. They hadn't paid for the steel reinforcement Ethan installed when one beam began splitting. Yet someone sitting behind a computer had decided Ethan owed them money to drive over it. He called the number on the letter. After 11 minutes of recorded music, a woman answered. "I think there's been a mistake," Ethan said. "You're charging me $1,200 to use a bridge on my own property." Keys clicked. "Our records identify the crossing as associated with the Mercer property access route. Have you ever seen the bridge?" Silence. "Sir, I can only tell you what the file says." Something inside Ethan went still. Until then, he had assumed somebody entered the wrong parcel number. Now he understood. The bank believed the file more than the man who had lived beside that creek for his entire life. Ethan folded the letter, put on his boots, and walked down to Miller Creek. Under the western beam, hidden beneath rust and moss, was a steel plate Samuel had welded there decades earlier. Ethan wiped it clean. "Kol farm omia nowa sute opcech, shipatru." His thumb stayed on the letters. Then he looked beyond the bridge toward the 600 acres the bank had just taken. And one question entered his mind. If they believed the bridge belonged to them, why was all their land sitting on the other side of it? When Ethan was a boy, the bridge never seemed valuable. It was simply part of the farm. His father drove the Ford across it every morning. Cattle trailers rattled over its deck in autumn. During hay season, tractors crossed so often that dust sometimes hung above Miller Creek until sunset. But in 1984, none of it existed. There had only been water. Samuel Cole bought the farm knowing Miller Creek divided the property near its most useful working area. The county road ran south. Much of the pasture lay north. Samuel could have complained. Instead, he built. He bought timber from a sawmill 20 miles away. One neighbor brought an excavator. Another loaned chains and a tractor. For almost 2 weeks, men worked beside the creek. Ethan was 8. His main responsibility was staying out of the way. He remembered his father standing in muddy water, with his sleeves rolled above his elbows, shouting measurements while a beam swung slowly from chains. Samuel built it as though it needed to outlive him. Eventually, it did. Years passed. Properties changed hands. The Mercer family acquired land north of the Cole farm. Their easiest route to the county road followed an old gravel track across Samuel's bridge. Samuel never treated that like a business opportunity. If the Mercers needed to move cattle, he opened the gate. If logging trucks were coming, they called first. Hunters usually stopped at the farmhouse before crossing. Once, teenage Ethan asked why his father never charged them. Samuel was replacing a loose plank. He drove a nail into the timber and said, "Neighbors shouldn't need a cash register between them." Then his expression became serious. But permission is permission. Ownership is ownership. Never confuse the two. At the time, Ethan barely listened. Samuel kept everything anyway. Receipts, surveys, Repair invoices. Handwritten notes. Ethan used to make fun of the metal box where his father stored them. "You planning to return the bridge someday?" Samuel would smile and drop another receipt inside. The joke stopped being funny after Samuel died. Ethan inherited the farm, the machinery, the bridge, and every repair that came with them. When floodwater ripped boards loose in 2008, Ethan replaced them. When a beam cracked in 2016, Ethan reinforced it. When runoff destroyed part of the gravel approach, Ethan paid for another load. Nobody from the Mercer property sent money. Nobody from a bank did either. Ethan never asked. That evening, however, he stood inside Samuel's old workshop staring at the shelves. Dust covered everything. Then he saw the gray metal box. He pulled it down. Inside were decades of receipts, surveys, and envelopes. Several bore the Mercer name. Ethan opened the oldest one. By the time he finished reading, his anger had changed into something colder. His father hadn't merely preserved proof of construction. Samuel had documented every time someone else had been given permission to cross. The first letter was dated October 1997. Ethan knew the signature, Thomas Mercer, the man who had once owned most of the acreage the bank now controlled. The letter thanked Samuel for allowing the Mercer family to bring cattle across the coal bridge while another route was being repaired. One sentence made Ethan stop. "We appreciate you allowing us to cross your bridge." Ethan read it again. Your bridge. Not their bridge. Not a shared bridge. Your bridge. He placed Thomas Mercer's letter beside the bank's $1,200 invoice. 40 years of history sat on one side of the table. 3 months of bank ownership sat on the other. Ethan pulled out the old survey maps. The Mercer property stretched north and east almost 600 acres of timber, pasture, and elevated ground. On paper, it looked impressive. Then Ethan noticed the roads. An old route ran east toward County Road 16. He knew it existed. What he didn't know was whether anybody could still use it. The next morning, Ethan drove around the property and parked beside a rusted eastern gate. He continued on foot. Within minutes, he understood. Blackberry thickets swallowed parts of the road. Young trees grew through old tire tracks. Rainwater had carved channels through the center. Farther down, the ground became soft. Then the road disappeared almost completely into mud and reeds. Ethan stood there listening to frogs in the wet grass. Maybe a tractor could have crossed decades earlier during a dry summer. But a loaded timber truck? Construction equipment? A buyer trying to inspect 600 acres? Not without serious work. Ethan slowly turned toward the distant ridge. A strange feeling moved through him. The Mercers hadn't used Samuel's bridge because it saved them 5 minutes. They had used it because it worked. Their gravel road descended through the northern property, crossed Miller Creek on the coal bridge, traveled across Ethan's farm, then reached the county road. That was the practical entrance. That evening, Ethan spread both maps across the kitchen table. He traced every realistic route with his finger. Again and again, the lines narrowed, until they reached one point, Miller Creek, 40 feet of timber. A bridge Samuel Cole built when Ethan was 8 years old. He picked up the bank's invoice. Until that moment, Ethan had been asking why a bank was charging him $1,200 to use his own bridge. Now another question mattered more. The bank had acquired 600 acres. It owned the trees, the pasture, the development potential. But if that eastern road couldn't support real traffic, had the bank actually purchased 600 acres without understanding how it intended to reach them? Ethan had owned farmland for 23 years without ever caring much about the word easement. By Wednesday, it seemed capable of deciding everything. At the county records office, he spread Samuel's papers across a table. Dates, parcel maps, rights-of-way, recorded agreements. The language made his head hurt. Then a clerk located an old Mercer deed. Ethan found the access provision. His stomach tightened. There was a recorded right-of-way across part of the coal property. For a few seconds, Ethan felt foolish. Maybe the bank was right. Maybe all Samuel's receipts meant nothing. He read the document again. Then slower. The deed described passage across land. But Ethan could find nothing transferring ownership of the bridge itself. Nothing saying the Mercer family had purchased Samuel's structure. Nothing saying the northern landowner could charge the Cole family to cross it. and nothing clearly explaining who was responsible for maintaining the bridge. Ethan closed the folder. He needed someone who actually understood the language. The following afternoon, he sat across from property attorney Rachel Bennett. She didn't give him the dramatic answer he wanted. That frustrated him at first. Rachel explained that access disputes could depend on exact deed wording, historical use, maintenance agreements, and state law. A line drawn across a map didn't automatically answer every question about the structure sitting on that line. "Then whose bridge is it?" Ethan asked. Rachel looked at him. "I'm not going to guess just because you want a fast answer." Ethan leaned back. It sounded harsh, but after 3 days of dealing with people who were willing to make assumptions without seeing the property, Rachel's caution felt strangely reassuring. Then she found Thomas Mercer's 1,997 letter. She read it twice. "Keep this." "Why?" "Because it tells us how a previous owner understood the arrangement." She pointed to 2 words. "Your bridge." It wasn't a magic sentence. It didn't erase the easement, but it showed that history was more complicated than the bank's computer file suggested. That evening, Ethan returned to Samuel's workshop. He sorted the metal box into piles. Construction, repairs, surveys, correspondence. Then he found a handwritten note dated 2003. Samuel's handwriting. "Mercer bringing logging trucks Friday. Permission for crossing only. Check bridge afterward." Ethan ran his thumb over the faded ink. For the first time in years, he could almost hear his father speaking. Permission is permission. Ownership is ownership. Never confuse the two. The bank had arrived with a foreclosure deed and a database. Samuel Cole had left behind 40 years of memory. And Ethan was beginning to understand why his father had been so careful. By Thursday night, Ethan's kitchen looked less like a home than an evidence room. Receipts covered the table. Surveys reached the counter. Photographs, tax records, repair invoices, and handwritten notes formed small piles across every open surface. Taken individually, many looked worthless. 12 bags of concrete, bridge spikes, lumber, gravel, steel. Together they told 42 years of history. 1,984. Samuel bought the original beams. 1,991. New decking. 1,997. Thomas Mercer thanked him for permission. 2003. Logging trucks crossed with permission. 2008. Ethan rebuilt the flood-damaged approach. Different decades. Same bridge. Same family paying for it. Ethan picked up the $1,200 invoice. The amount no longer made him angry because it was expensive. It made him angry because of what it implied. Someone who had owned the land for 3 months was trying to rewrite a story that began when Ethan was 8. Near midnight, he found an old photograph inside a cloudy plastic sleeve. Samuel stood beside Miller Creek in August 1984. He was younger in the photograph than Ethan was now. Mud covered his jeans. One hand rested against a newly positioned timber beam. Behind him, the bridge was only half finished. On the back, Samuel had written, "North Crossing, August 1984, built for farm access." Ethan sat quietly. His father had been dead for years. Most days Ethan could remember Samuel without feeling the loss sharply anymore. That night was different. He stared at the photograph and suddenly remembered the calloused hands, the work shirts hanging behind the kitchen door, the way Samuel always checked a gate twice before leaving. Then Ethan found another Mercer letter. Thomas Mercer was planning a timber harvest. He asked Samuel for permission to send loaded trucks across the bridge for approximately 3 weeks. He even offered to contribute if the trucks damaged the decking. Ethan felt something rise in his chest. Not triumph, sadness. Thomas Mercer understood something the bank apparently did not. The bridge had never been invisible. Someone maintained it. Someone carried the risk. Someone paid when it broke. At 12:17 a.m., Ethan photographed everything and emailed the files to Rachel. The next morning she called. "Don't contact the bank again yet. You found something?" "I found enough to want their explanation." That afternoon, another bank envelope arrived. Ethan opened it, standing beside the mailbox. The bank intended to send an appraisal team across the Cole property Monday morning. The final sentence wasn't a request. It simply gave the time they planned to arrive. Ethan stared at it. After everything he had sent them, they still hadn't asked. Ethan's first instinct was still to solve the problem peacefully. That was how people around Miller Creek had always handled things. A broken fence meant a phone call. Stray cattle meant helping first and asking questions afterward. His father had taught him that. So, Friday morning, Ethan called the bank one more time. On the table before him sat the invoice, the Mercer letters, Samuel's receipts, and the appraisal notice. After 2 transfers, he reached Daniel Price in asset management. Ethan explained the bridge history. Daniel responded with the same sentence Ethan had heard before. Our records show access rights connected to the Mercer parcel. I understand there may be access rights, Ethan said. I'm asking why you're charging me for a bridge my family built. The fee was generated according to the property file. Then somebody needs to look at the property file. I can submit a dispute. How long? Up to 30 days. Ethan looked at the appraisal notice. Your people are coming Monday. That inspection is already scheduled. Did anyone ask me? The parcel has recorded access. Ethan gripped the edge of the table. For a moment he imagined Samuel sitting across from him. His father would have hated this not because a neighbor needed to cross, but because nobody was willing to acknowledge who was carrying the burden. I have letters from Thomas Mercer, asking my father for permission. I can't review historical correspondence. I have construction receipts. Those need to be submitted through the dispute process. I have maintenance records. Same process. Ethan stared out toward Miller Creek. So you can send me a $1,200 bill without reviewing any of that. Daniel went quiet. Then came the sentence that finally changed Ethan's mood. I'm explaining the process available to you. Ethan understood. He wasn't speaking to a neighbor. He wasn't even really speaking to Daniel. He was speaking to a system designed to continue moving until somebody forced it to notice a problem. Submit the dispute, Ethan said. Before hanging up, he added, do not send the appraisal team across that bridge until this is resolved. I can't cancel an inspection based on a disputed maintenance fee. Ethan's jaw tightened. This isn't about your fee anymore. He ended the call. 20 minutes later, Rachel called. She had reviewed the recorded documents. Don't touch the bridge yet, she said. Ethan waited. But? The bank appears to be treating 2 separate things as though they're identical. Which things? Whatever passage rights their parcel has. And control over the bridge itself. Outside, the crossing sat silently above Miller Creek. For 42 years, it had connected 2 properties. Now, for the first time, it was revealing just how different those 2 properties really were. Fog covered Miller Creek Monday morning. At 8:12, Ethan heard tires on gravel. He was already waiting near the entrance. A white SUV stopped beside the farm. Another vehicle pulled in behind it. 3 people stepped out: an appraiser, a surveyor, and a photographer. We're here for the Mercer property, the appraiser said. I know. He glanced down the gravel lane. We were told access is through here. It usually is. The man relaxed. Good. We'll only be a couple of hours. Ethan remained where he was. But you're not crossing today. The appraiser looked confused. Excuse me? The bank was told Friday that the crossing is disputed. The 3 men exchanged looks. Nobody had told them. For 10 minutes they stood beside their vehicles making calls. Eventually the appraiser returned. The bank says the parcel has a recorded right-of-way. Then the bank can send my attorney the documents explaining exactly what that allows. We're just here to do an appraisal. I know, and I'm not blaming you. Ethan held up the invoice. But somebody at your bank is charging me $1,200 to use the same bridge they're sending you across without asking. The appraiser stared at the paper. For the first time, embarrassment replaced irritation on his face. That wasn't explained to us. I figured. Ethan stepped back. He wasn't trying to humiliate 3 men who had simply been given incomplete instructions. Eventually, they left. At 10:46, Daniel Price called. This time his voice had changed. I understand you denied our appraisal team access. I asked you not to send them. The bank maintains the Mercer parcel possesses recorded access. Then send Rachel the complete documentation. The inspection is necessary for valuation. Ethan looked beyond the creek toward 600 acres of timber. There it was. Valuation. What access are you using in that valuation, Daniel? Silence. It was the first question Daniel didn't seem prepared to answer. Over the next 2 days, Ethan walked the property boundary with an updated survey. The truth became clearer with every mile. The eastern route was deteriorated. The west was complicated by terrain and neighboring parcels. For normal vehicles, almost everything practical narrowed toward Miller Creek. Wednesday evening, a surveyor stood beneath the bridge with Ethan and Rachel. He checked the measurements. "The structure is where your family records indicate." Ethan looked upward at the beams. For days, people had argued about $1,200, but the money had become almost irrelevant, because the bank wasn't merely depending on Ethan's land. It was depending on 42-year-old infrastructure it had apparently never bothered to inspect. And the next morning, Ethan learned something else. The bridge could carry his pickup. That didn't mean it could safely carry whatever the bank might someday want to send across it. Frank Holloway inspected the bridge Thursday morning. He had spent more than 30 years around rural structures, drainage crossings, and timber construction. Ethan asked him one question. "If this road suddenly starts carrying heavier traffic, what am I dealing with?" Frank didn't answer. He walked the bridge first. He inspected connections, photographed the deck, climbed beneath the western beam, tapped timber with a small hammer. "You reinforced this?" 2016. "With your father?" Ethan shook his head. Dad had already passed. Frank nodded and continued working. That small question stayed with Ethan. Samuel had built the bridge. Ethan had spent the years since trying to keep it alive. Now strangers who had never replaced a single board were making plans that might determine what crossed it. "What usually uses this?" Frank asked. "Pickup, tractor, cattle trailer. And what does the bank want?" "They won't tell me." Frank looked up. "Then that's something I'd want answered." One section of decking showed deterioration. A connection needed closer evaluation. Erosion had developed near the eastern approach. The bridge wasn't collapsing, but Frank refused to pretend age and appearance could answer questions about future commercial loads. 42 years of farm traffic does not automatically tell you what repeated heavier traffic will do. Ethan looked at the beams his father had installed. For the first time, anger gave way to fear. Not fear of losing an argument. Fear that somebody else's assumptions could destroy the last major structure Samuel had built with his own hands. "If the bridge needs upgrading for different traffic," Ethan asked, "who should pay?" Frank stood. "That's not an engineering question." "Exactly." That afternoon, Rachel contacted the bank. She requested the recorded access language, any bridge maintenance agreement, any document assigning repair responsibility, and the basis for the $1,200 fee. Then she added another point. Until the bridge's condition and intended use were clarified, nobody should assume it was suitable for traffic beyond its established pattern. Daniel promised to refer the matter internally. That evening, Ethan walked alone to Miller Creek. Sunlight turned the old timber orange. He placed one hand on the railing. As a child, he had thought his father built 40 feet of wood across water. Now he understood Samuel had built something far more valuable. A connection. Without it, 600 acres didn't disappear, but their usefulness changed dramatically. The bank believed the acreage was the asset. Ethan finally understood the truth. Sometimes the most valuable thing isn't what lies at the end of a road. Sometimes it's the piece of infrastructure that makes the road possible. The bank finally sent its documents Friday. Rachel reviewed them before Ethan arrived. "There is a recorded access right," she said. Ethan nodded. But nothing they've provided makes them owner of your bridge, and nothing explains that $1,200 charge. Ethan looked through the office window. "So I shut the bridge?" "No." Rachel's answer was immediate. "You don't destroy somebody's legitimate access rights. You maintain your property, document the condition, comply with whatever obligations actually exist, and stop treating the bank's assumptions as your responsibility." Frank's inspection had already confirmed what Ethan had been postponing. The deck needed work. The eastern approach needed attention. And before anybody considered heavier use, the structure needed proper evaluation. For years, Ethan had replaced boards one at a time. This time, he made a different decision. If the deck needed rehabilitation, he would do it properly. Monday morning, a flatbed arrived carrying replacement timber. Workers began removing boards shortly after 8. One plank, then another, then another. Each time a board lifted, Ethan could see more of Miller Creek below. The sound of pry bars and hammers echoed through the trees. By noon, almost the entire drivable deck had been removed. Only the structural beams remained above the creek. For the first time since 1984, there was no usable crossing. Ethan stood at the western edge staring into the open space. His chest tightened. He remembered being 8 years old watching Samuel put that deck down. Now Ethan was the one taking it up. It felt almost like dismantling a memory. One of the workers asked, "You okay?" Ethan nodded. "Just never thought I'd see it like this again." At 1:36, Daniel called. "We've been informed the crossing has been removed. The bridge deck is under documented maintenance. How long will it be unavailable?" "Until we know what it requires. We have another inspection this week." "Then you need another route or another date." Daniel's tone hardened. "We require access." Ethan looked through the empty frame toward the road climbing into the bank's 600 acres. "I understand." "Then restore the crossing." Ethan's voice remained calm. "When your bank explains what traffic it wants, what its documents actually provide, and who is responsible for whatever improvements that traffic requires, we'll know what we're dealing with. You cannot interfere with our rights." "I'm not deciding your rights. The attorneys can do that." Ethan looked down at the stack of weathered boards. "But I'm done pretending my father's bridge is an unlimited commercial highway because somebody entered it that way in a computer." 2 days later, a black SUV came down the gravel road. 2 bank representatives stepped out. They walked toward Miller Creek, then stopped. The road ended in front of them. Across 40 feet of open beams lay 600 acres they technically owned, close enough to see, impossible to reach by vehicle from where they stood. One man turned toward Ethan. "When will our bridge reopen?" Ethan slowly looked at him. "Our bridge?" Then he pointed to the steel plate beneath the beam. "Kol farm omia noa sute opcet shipatru." "The bridge you charged me $1,200 to use?" Nobody answered. And for the first time, the bank was standing inside the mistake it had made. The older bank representative introduced himself as Robert Hale, Regional Asset Manager. Unlike Daniel Price, Robert had finally come to Miller Creek. He walked to the edge of the dismantled crossing. Across the creek, the gravel road climbed toward the Mercer acreage. 600 acres sat less than 50 yards away. But without a drivable bridge, those 50 yards might as well have been miles. "When will the work be completed?" Robert asked. "When we know what the bridge needs. We have contractors requiring access." "What kind?" Robert hesitated. "That's internal bank business." Ethan nodded toward the exposed beams. "What they intend to drive across my structure is my business." Robert's face tightened. "We possess an access right, and nobody here is pretending your deed doesn't contain access." Ethan pointed toward the timber. "But a right to pass across land doesn't tell me whether 42-year-old beams can safely carry whatever vehicle you choose." Robert looked beneath the structure. For the first time, he seemed less annoyed than concerned. Ethan continued. "My father built this bridge. My family paid for it. My family repaired it. When the flood damaged it, I stood down here with neighbors replacing boards while the Mercer property contributed nothing." He paused. "And then your bank showed up and sent me a bill." Robert said nothing. The anger Ethan had contained for 2 weeks finally entered his voice. $1,200 isn't going to ruin me." He pointed toward the coal plate. "But don't tell me I owe you for something my father spent his own money and his own hands building." The second representative stopped taking photographs. Robert looked again toward the inaccessible acreage. Suddenly, the problem was visible. The bank wanted an appraisal. Buyers would want inspections. Timber operations might require trucks. Future construction might require heavy equipment. Every practical plan converged on Miller Creek. On infrastructure, the bank had treated like a meaningless line on a map. Finally, Robert asked, "What do you want?" Ethan answered immediately, "Withdraw the fee. That can be reviewed. You're standing here because your review failed." Robert's jaw tightened. "Anything else?" "Yes." Ethan looked across the exposed bridge. "If you expect increased traffic, then we put the arrangement in writing. We define what can cross. We determine what improvements are necessary. We decide who pays for those improvements and who handles future damage." Robert frowned. "You want the bank to pay for your bridge?" "No." Ethan shook his head. "I want the bank to stop expecting me to subsidize your 600 acres. That changed the conversation. For decades, the Mercers and Coles had operated through calls, handshakes, and neighborly cooperation. A corporation had inherited the benefit of that kindness and mistaken it for an entitlement. An hour later, Robert left. The next morning, Ethan received an email. The $1,200 fee was suspended. 3 days later, the appraisal was postponed. Then Robert called again. This time he wanted a meeting at Rachel Bennett's office, and someone from the bank's legal department would be joining him. The meeting lasted 23 minutes before anyone mentioned the bridge. That told Ethan plenty. Robert Hale sat beside Catherine Mills from the bank's legal department. Rachel sat beside Ethan. Catherine began with recorded access, historic use, and the bank's desire to resolve the dispute efficiently. Ethan listened quietly. Then Rachel asked one question. Has the bank determined the legal and contractual basis for the $1,200 charge? Catherine glanced at her notes. The charge has been withdrawn. Ethan looked at her. Withdrawn? Yes. Not suspended. Not under review. Gone. For 2 weeks, Ethan had been told the charge came from the property file as though that sentence ended every discussion. Now $1,200 disappeared in seconds. Rachel continued. And the bridge? Robert leaned forward. That's why we're here. Finally, the updated appraisal process had exposed the problem the original foreclosure review apparently missed. Without reliable vehicle access across Miller Creek, the acreage was more difficult to value under the assumptions the bank had made. The timber remained. The pasture remained. The potential remained. But a buyer would ask obvious questions. How do trucks enter? What vehicles can cross? Who repairs the structure? Who pays if heavier use requires upgrades? What happens when legitimate maintenance closes the route? 2 weeks earlier, the bank behaved as though those questions already had answers. Now it needed answers badly enough to negotiate. We'd like the crossing restored as soon as reasonably possible, Robert said. For what kind of use? Ethan asked. Normal access. What is normal? Robert paused. My pickup is normal to me, Ethan said. A loaded logging truck may be normal to somebody harvesting your timber. They are not the same load. Catherine glanced at Rachel. Then perhaps a more clearly defined agreement makes sense. Ethan almost laughed. That was the first thing he had wanted from the beginning. Rachel outlined the necessary subjects. Permitted use. Maintenance. Inspections. Improvements. Responsibility for damage. Temporary closure during repairs. Cost sharing if expanded use required stronger infrastructure. Then Robert asked the question that completed the reversal. What would Mr. Cole require in exchange for providing the bank greater certainty of access than the existing documents currently provide? Ethan leaned back. 2 weeks ago, they were charging him. Now they were asking what certainty would cost them. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't a trick. The bridge hadn't magically become valuable. Its value had always existed. The bank simply hadn't noticed until the deck was gone. Ethan looked at Rachel. If there's a new agreement, it needs to protect both properties. And if we can't reach one? Robert asked. Ethan looked toward Samuel's old letters lying on the table. Then everyone lives with whatever rights already exist. Silence followed. Ethan suddenly understood something his father had known decades earlier. The most important piece of property isn't always the largest field. Sometimes it is 40 feet of timber over a creek, because 600 acres on one side can depend entirely on the 40 feet that allow people to reach them. The first proposal arrived 4 days later. Rachel called while Ethan was repairing a fence. The bank sent an offer. Ethan rested his pliers on the post. How much? Rachel laughed. You've been dealing with bankers too long. It's 12 pages. That evening, Ethan read the proposal at the same kitchen table where the story had begun. The contrast was almost ridiculous. The bank needed 1 page to tell him he supposedly owed $1,200. Now it needed 12 pages to explain what it wanted from him. Defined access, specified vehicle classes, inspection procedures, maintenance schedules, cost sharing for improvements associated with expanded use, responsibility for unusual damage, and several pages in, compensation for granting the bank greater certainty and broader access than whatever rights already existed. Ethan leaned back. For a moment, he looked toward the empty chair where Samuel used to sit. He didn't want revenge. He didn't want to trap 600 acres behind Miller Creek forever. His father never would have wanted that either. Samuel had allowed neighbors to cross because neighbors helped neighbors. But kindness only worked when both sides remembered it was kindness. Ethan wanted one thing: acknowledgement. If another property depended on infrastructure the Cole family built, repaired, and carried responsibility for, that dependency needed to exist on paper. Before memories faded again, Rachel negotiated for 2 weeks. The bank wanted broad future access. Ethan insisted on limits for heavier traffic. The bank wanted certainty. Ethan wanted protection. Eventually, they reached terms. The bank would contribute to the engineering review and improvements required for the access it wanted. Maintenance responsibilities would be defined. Extraordinary damage from authorized heavier traffic would not automatically become Ethan's expense. And the $1,200 fee? Gone. Completely. When the final agreement arrived, Ethan stopped before signing. One sentence described the crossing separately from the surrounding land. He read it twice. For reasons he couldn't fully explain, his eyes burned. Samuel had understood that distinction 42 years earlier. Now someone had finally written it down. Ethan signed. Work resumed. New decking replaced the deteriorated boards. Connections were repaired. The approaches were strengthened where necessary. After inspection, the crossing reopened. Several weeks later, Ethan was near the barn when a bank SUV approached Miller Creek. The vehicle slowed, then stopped. The driver lowered the window. "Mr. Cole?" Ethan walked over. "We have scheduled access to the Mercer property. Just confirming before we cross." Ethan looked at the rebuilt bridge. For an instant, he saw his father standing in muddy water in 1984. Then he looked back at the driver. "You're good." The SUV crossed slowly. No shouting. No victory speech. No dramatic check. Just a few words that could have prevented the entire dispute. "Just confirming before we cross." That evening, Ethan went into Samuel's workshop. The gray metal box waited on the bench. He placed a copy of the new agreement inside. Then the original $1,200 invoice. Before closing the lid, Ethan found the old photograph again. Samuel beside the unfinished bridge. Young, muddy, proud. Ethan smiled. "All those receipts, Dad." He shook his head softly. "I finally get it." Samuel hadn't kept records because he distrusted people. He kept them because people change. Owners change. Land changes hands. Memories disappear. And one day, somebody who never witnessed the handshake may inherit the paperwork and mistake generosity for ownership. Ethan closed the box. Outside, headlights moved slowly through the trees. A vehicle crossed Miller Creek. The rebuilt timber carried the weight without complaint. The bridge was open again. Neighbors could still cross. The bank could still reach its property. Nothing had been trapped forever. But one thing had changed permanently. From that day forward, nobody on either side of Miller Creek would ever again confuse permission with ownership.